Let's talk a little bit about that upward trajectory that Dr. Scott referred to. That he wants you to believe is proof that Nikolas does not have FASD. That he just has a personality disorder. Dr. Scott told you about Nikolas's experience at Coral Springs Elementary. And he agreed, I think everybody agrees, that the best environment for Nikolas was a highly structured one with specialized instruction, specialized trained teachers, one-on-one. Probably why he did so well when he was with his psychologists for treatment, or Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny, because he was getting that type of interaction. And he ends up in the cluster. And Dr. Scott tells you that in kindergarten he was retained. They could have promoted him, but they didn't because mom and the school wanted him to mature. And then he continued to talk about how well Nikolas did at Coral Springs. But what he didn't tell you until he was questioned by Miss Curtis was that Nikolas received a good cause promotion from 1st to 2nd grade. And that good cause promotion does not mean that he was doing good. It means that he could not be retained because he was a special needs student and it would be illegal for them to do it again. What else did Dr. Scott not tell you? He did not tell you that Nikolas did not meet the criteria for promotion from 3rd to 4th grade, but they promoted him because he got a 2 out of a 5 on the FCATs. He didn't tell you that. And he also didn't tell you that from 4th to 5th grade, Nikolas received another good cause promotion. So let's talk about that academic trajectory that he says Nikolas was on. Why didn't he tell you those things? Because being retained or receiving a good cause promotion doesn't support his theory that Nikolas was on an upwards trajectory and that he didn't continue to have academic struggles like children with FASD do. And we know on cross-examination when Ms. Curtis actually showed him that standardized testing that he said Nikolas did so well on, that he had to admit that those scores indicated that Nikolas had either little success or limited success. He wasn't progressing academically. And I just want to remind you of a few things that John Newnham and Lynn Rodriguez told you. They told you that Linda lacked the foundation of parenting, that she didn't utilize the services that they gave her, that she was overwhelmed and had a lack of support. And they told you that the entire time that Nikolas was at Coral Springs Elementary, that he was anxious, that he was fearful, and that he was nervous, and that he worried a lot, and that he looked at the 4, and he wasn't responsive to communication, and that he would apologize over and over again, even when he didn't need to. And they told you that Nikolas had obsessive compulsive tendencies like clock watching, consistently worrying about missing the bus, a bus that he never missed. He was worried his mother wouldn't pick him up. He asked the same questions over and over and over again, and he was skin picking. But Dr. Scott, who says he read all of the same records, didn't tell you that. Because if he did, then he also wouldn't be able to say that Nikolas was just anxious in 3rd grade. So he doesn't have FASD. Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny didn't even want to talk to Nikolas about the fact that he watched his father die or his mother die. And we now know that Nikolas was sexually abused, but traumatic life experiences were not even included in their evaluation. Not even a consideration. But Dr. Denny, on cross-examination, did admit when Mr. Secor asked him that those events were traumatic and that they would have an impact on a child. Every provider at Coral Springs Elementary believed that Nikolas's bad behavior was the result of his emotional and behavioral disability. And the state of Florida could not bring in one witness that told you otherwise. And when Nikolas left Coral Springs Elementary and went to West Glades, he still had the same designation. He still had the same eligibility. But what changed? He was no longer in the cluster. He was no longer receiving special education because special instruction, that one-on-one he was getting, because they don't do that in middle school. And we also know that he continued to have that expressive and receptive language disorder that Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny told you he grew out of. How do we know that he still had that? Because we brought in Dr. Shamika Stanford. She is the leading forensic expert on speech and language pathology, and it's the only thing she does. She specializes in it. And what did she tell you? Rely on your memory about the impact that a receptive and expressive language disorder has on a child. But what she also told you, that it's a disorder that never goes away. But that's not consistent with a child that just has a personality disorder. But it is consistent with FASD. And why didn't the state of Florida bring in their own expert in speech and language pathology to tell you that Nikolas outgrew that disorder? Because there is no expert that would come in here and testify to that. You make a decision about who is more credible about whether or not Nikolas has a lifelong speech and language disorder. Let's talk about the principal from West Glades, Mr. Jack BC. This is a man that had dedicated his entire life to education, 35 years. He was the principal when Nick was there. He's now retired. He's a guardian ad litem, which is a program they have here in the court system. And he works with 2 kids who were prenatally exposed to alcohol. And he told you that they act very similar and have the very similar behaviors and disabilities that Nikolas does. He also told you that he taught at a behavioral center. And that's where kids go when their behavior is not a manifestation of their mental illness. That is not where Nikolas went. He went to Cross Creek, which is where children go whose behavior is a manifestation of their mental illness. And what did Mr. Vasey tell you, and also Jessica Clark, his family counselor, the entire time that he was at West Glades? They both told you that from the very beginning, and you can look at Jessica Clark's progress notes, September of his 6th grade year, September, we start school in August, that he struggled academically. He was struggling in math and language arts. And coincidentally, math is the area that children with FASD struggle with the most. And she also tells you how he doesn't understand things. He doesn't like one of his classes because they're introducing measurements, and he doesn't get it. So please read Jessica Clark's notes. This is the same time that Ms. Nast made that comment about the only thing that Nikolas wanted to do was set fires, I think, and kill people. That doesn't tell his whole story. So what is important from Mr. Vasey and Jessica Clark is that the struggles that Nikolas was having started in 6th grade, not in 8th grade. The records support that. what else did Jack Vasey tell you? That West Glades could not provide the services that Nikolas needed. They had 1,300 students and they could not do it. And that Nikolas belonged at Cross Creek. And I think all of you can remember the type of therapeutic educational environment Cross Creek is. And he said that he did not believe that Nikolas should have ever gone to MSD. Because if he couldn't handle it with 1,300 students without a therapeutic environment, then there is no way he could handle it with 3,300 students. The judge will tell you that it is perfectly fine for a lawyer to talk to a witness. She will give you that instruction. And we know from Mr. Vesey's testimony that the morning that he was supposed to come in here and testify, that he received a phone call from his friend, not his lawyer, but a friend who happened to be a lawyer, Christopher Whitelock, and on that phone call was Mr. Marcus. And you heard how that phone call made Jack Vasey feel. And this is directly from his testimony. They were concerned about the testimony that I was going to give and how I might implicate other people. And then he said, "I'm glad I didn't have my blood pressure checked when it hit." I don't mean to sound sarcastic. It was a very uncomfortable phone call. And to this hour, I don't understand why that ever occurred. I feel it was enough to make me feel uncomfortable to not want to come in and testify. That was my initial reaction. It still is. You know, it's the day I'm coming in to testify, and all of a sudden I get this call. I was very uncomfortable. I don't know why that call was made. You get to make that decision. But he was brave anyways, and he came in here and he testified and he told you the truth, and he did that because that was the right thing to do. And you know who else was really brave? Carrie Yon. She was brave and she was persistent, and you know how terrified she was of Nikolas Cruz. She told you that she would drive to work and her stomach would be sick, knowing that she was going to have him in her classroom. But she didn't want him expelled. She didn't want him suspended. She wanted him to get help. She knew that West Glades was not the place that he belonged. And she went to people. And some people helped. And other people said he has every right to be here. But you know what else she did? She kept 152 pages of documents related to Nikolas Cruz for 8 years. And why did she do that? Because she was concerned that the copy she gave to the school would disappear. When we got the school records from the Broward County School District, we didn't get those records. We got those records from Carrie Yon. So it turns out that Carrie Yon was right, that records disappear. We know that eventually Nikolas got into Cross Creek. He got the services that he needed. We also know that at Cross Creek you have an individual education plan and that you work at the level that you're at academically, and that you get services throughout your entire day. And Dr. Scott referred to Dr. Klein's evaluation. This is the evaluation that got Nikolas into Cross Creek, one of them. And of this 7-page document, which I encourage you to read, he took 2 words out of this entire document. Deceives others. Because that's what supports his diagnosis. He didn't want you to look at the whole report, right? Because if you looked at the whole report, then you would know that they did some academic testing before Nikolas went to Cross Creek. And you would know that when he was 15 years old, he was reading at a grade equivalency of 4.9. A math equivalency of 5.4, and a writing level of 3.3. So let's talk about that upward academic trajectory he was telling you about. It doesn't exist. And if you look at the records, that supports that. And you can also read the psychosocial evaluation that was done by Ms. Posey. She testified. And she told you that Linda was desperate to get the right diagnosis, that it was not just ADHD. She was screaming for help. And just like Mr. Satz said, she had been doing it for years. That's the level of frustration that Dr. Jones was telling you about when parents are up against the things that they have to face before they know that they have a child with FASD, and the importance of a proper diagnosis. And the state could not bring in one academic provider throughout his whole academic career to tell you that he didn't continue to struggle. Not one. And we know socially from the testimony that we heard, the records that we reviewed, that he continued to struggle with that issue and through his entire life, and he still does. And the state of Florida could not bring in one witness that actually knew Nikolas, that grew up with Nikolas, that taught Nikolas, that provided him with services, to come in here and tell you that he was not socially impaired. A language disorder is a hallmark of FASD. It's not a personality disorder. And that's why Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny wanted you to disregard it, so you wouldn't consider FASD. And we know that Nikolas suffered from severe anxiety his entire life. But Dr. Scott and Dr. Denny didn't want you to think that. An anxiety disorder is a hallmark feature of a child that has FASD. But if you disregard it, he only had it in 3rd grade, then you're less likely to believe the truth. And Nikolas suffered from depression, and that is also a hallmark of FASD. Nikolas also suffered from OCD, a hallmark feature of FASD. But Dr. Scott wants you to ignore the medical diagnosis from 3 providers that actually knew Nikolas, that saw Nikolas and provided him with treatment, and say he doesn't have it. Because if he has it, then he doesn't have FASD. And just because a kid can swim with floaties doesn't mean they can swim when you take them off. And that's what happened when Nick went to MSD. Dr. Scott tried to tell you that everybody wanted him to go there, that he was doing so well. But we know that that's not true, because the ESE specialist did not want him at MSD. The LEA specialist did not want him at MSD. It was not the right placement for him. And when those people went to Denise Reed, the assistant principal at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, she was in charge of ESE, they were told to stay in their lane. He never should have left Cross Creek. That is the environment that he belongs in. And here's another almost terrifying thing. Dr. Ortiz, her progress note, psychiatrist from Cross Creek, wrote in her notes that because of Nikolas's fascination with the military and his fascination with guns, that junior ROTC was not recommended, not advised. And not only did Nikolas take the junior ROTC class, but he enrolled in marksmanship. And we know from Dr. Scott, the clip that you saw, that at MSD, in the marksmanship class, in the junior ROTC, is where he learned how to shoot a gun. Despite the psychiatrist saying he should not be involved in that. All of the evidence that you have heard and seen that is supported by the records, no, everybody told you that Linda never truly appreciated what was wrong with Nikolas. she loved Nikolas very much. And she loved Zachary very much. But if love could have fixed everything, then everything would have been fine. But the evidence has shown you that Linda consistently minimized, enabled, ignored, excused, defended, and ultimately lied to the very people that were trying to help Nikolas from what he needed the most. What Dr. Jones tells you is the most important thing, a proper diagnosis. And with a proper diagnosis of FASD, maybe Linda would have had the relief and the hope that Dr. Jones talked about that parents get when they finally understand what is wrong with their child. She would have realized she was not a bad parent and that Nikolas was not a bad kid, that he was a mentally ill, brain-damaged child. But Linda lived in the world that she had created in her 4,500 square foot house. It's a consistent theme throughout her life. And in that adoption report, if you choose to read it, there's a lot of information about Linda's life and where she grew up, how her mother abandoned her, a lot of the things that I told you in opening statement. And Linda's financial insecurity, the betrayal and abandonment that she felt from Roger, forced her to put locks on fridges, ration food from her children, kept the house thermostat at 80 degrees, and she would tell people that she didn't have any money to buy food for her children, so people would bring groceries. And at the very same time, she had over $800,000 in the bank. It defies logic. But Linda wasn't thinking logically. She was an overwhelmed, lonely mother of two very difficult children. And every provider, Dr. Kravitz, Dr. Negan, you have the records from Dr. Dejani, all told you that Linda was not compliant with recommendations for treatment. She was not compliant with medication. And she would try and save money by not giving Nikolas the medication that he so desperately needed. And Dr. Negan made a recommendation that Nikolas should go into a residential treatment place, a facility. And we know from Steve Sinkoff that she didn't want to do that because she would lose his Social Security benefits and she couldn't survive. That's part of the shame and the stigma that Dr. Jones tells us about. We have tried with every fiber of our being to bring you all of the information that you need in order to make the best appropriate decision from people that were actually involved in Nikolas's life. And ladies and gentlemen, you have to make a decision about whether or not another human being lives or dies. And I am sure that this is not the first difficult decision that you've had to make in your life. And when you have to make difficult decisions, I'm sure that you may talk to a friend, you may seek spiritual guidance, you may do some research, you may consult an expert. And when you have to make a life or death decision, do you want an expert that is a generalist, that practices a little bit of everything? Or do you want an expert that specializes in the area of FASD? Do you want a jack of all trades? Or do you want Dr. Jones, who is the leading expert in the world? He literally was the first person to diagnose somebody with FSA, fetal alcohol syndrome, in 1973. Do you want Dr. Connor, who is the #1 neuropsychologist who specializes in what? FASD, that's it. Or do you want to listen to Dr. Scott, and Dr. Denny, who have admitted to you that they are not experts in FASD. But what do? They come in here and they try and tell you that Dr. Connor's testing is flawed. But what does Dr. Connor tell you? Because he's an expert in FASD, that he has developed a very specific battery over his 30 years of experience, a battery that has been published and peer-reviewed, a battery of tests that is specifically designed to see if somebody has FASD or neurological impairments. And that's why his chart looks the way that it looks, because those tests are designed specifically for that diagnosis. So Dr. Denny, board certified, highly credentialed, wants you to look at all of the testing that isn't even related to FASD. So you decide who is more credible, who you want to rely on when you're making a life or death decision. Do you want to rely on the #1 experts in the country on FASD? Or do you want to rely on 2 experts that are not?